Bava Batra Daf Yud Zayin and Yud Chetz, beginning of Perek Lo Yahfor. We're part of a system, הקדמה Lo Yahfor, an introduction to this Perek, the second Perek of Bava Batra, which is Lo Yahfor. And one can learn Lo Yahfor like any other piece of Gemara, very technically dealing with the rights of neighbors, claims one upon the other, and certainly it is that as well. But as we do in the Matmonim, is always try and understand what's the Torah really teaching us here? What is the underpinning principle that underlies the whole understanding? And we'll see that we're learning about the role of boundaries, and the fact that boundaries separate individuals from one another, but doesn't necessarily separate a system. You can have a system made up of individuals between whom there are boundaries, and those boundaries are very important, but they become destructive if one thinks that the boundaries actually isolate the individuals from the bigger system that engages them. And that's the point at which Bilam gets Ruach HaKodesh when he's been tasked to curse Am Yisrael, to curse the Jewish people, and he blesses them because Vayaret Yisrael Shochen, he saw Yisrael, one unit, one system, Shochen in the singular, dwelling as a single unit, Lishvatav, in separate camps. And Rashi brings the Medrash there that it's not just that he saw them in separate tribes, each of the tribes separately, but every family separately. And every tent building a system of privacy, that they didn't look into one another, that there was, each one had their own privacy, and yet it was one Yisrael. That ability to live within a bigger system as an individual was something that completely blew Bilam's mind and took him into a different plane of appreciation of what Klal Yisrael is. And that is the subject of Lo Yahfor. It was interesting, it was a very beautiful comment on YouTube from somebody, I don't know who it is, because on YouTube people just have their YouTube name, so I don't even know who it is, but if the person is listening and wants to contact me, I would love to hear from them, who just comments that he's been learning for 20 years, learning Gemara for 20 years, and it's got nothing really out of it, until by chance he discovered the Matmonim and how to look at Gemara so differently, and to try and understand what it is we really are getting at. And to understand it, we've got to go back to some of the differences between Bava Kama and Bava Metzia on the one hand, and Bava Batra on the other hand. We've talked about the fact that Bava Kama and Bava Metzia are founded on principles from the Torah, on mitzvot in the Torah, on psukim in the Torah, and halachot. And Bava Batra is primarily the custom of society and agreements between parties. It's built more on logic and social norms than it is on instructions and direction from Hashem through the Torah. One of the important elements of Bava Kama, which we've got to look at, is a Tosfos back on Daf Chav Zayin in Bava Kama, where Tosfos says, there we're talking about Haminiach et Hakad Bereshut Harabim. A person leaves you remember the famous Ming vase we had when we were learning Haminiach, and he leaves this Ming vase, or vase as they say, in the Reshut Harabim, in the public thoroughfare, and somebody damages it, or gets damaged by it. The Mishnah says you don't have to pay for the Ming vase, because it shouldn't have been lying in Rosh Hashanah. That's not where you keep Ming vases. And if he hurts himself, the owner of the vase doesn't have to pay the damages. So the Gemara says, Amai Potter, why doesn't he have to pay for the damages of the vase? Because he should have watched where he's walking. But the Gemara doesn't ask, why does the owner of the vase have to pay the damages? Sorry, he has to pay the damages in those cases. Why does the Gemara say, why does he have to pay the damages? This person should watch where he's walking. It's not my problem that you walked into my Ming vase. And then Tosfos gives a very important yesod. Deyoter yeshlo lishmor shelo yazik mishelo yuzak. A person needs to be more careful that he doesn't cause damage than that he isn't damaged. And that's the essence of Bava Kama. That means, from a perspective of survival instinct, we're careful. We're supposed to take care that we don't get damaged. You're supposed to look where you're walking, be careful where you go. The idea that you've got to be even more careful not to damage other people is a Bava Kama Dika concept. That's from the Torah. That's from Hashem saying, no, this is not just about the survival instinct and take care that you don't get damaged. This is about the way you treat others. This is about being careful not to damage other people. in the way you operate, in the way you function in your life. And that's the foundation of Bava Kama, that you have to be shomer, you have to take care of your ox, you have to take care of your fire, you have to take care of the pit that you built. You can't harbor a mazik and not protect people from that mazik, from that object that is capable of causing damage. That's a principle in Bava Kama. That being the case, we've got to look at our Gemara, and I'm not getting into it in a great deal of detail. You'll learn Daf Yud Zayin, Daf Yud Ches. We start with the principle of harchaka. Lo yachpor adam bor samuch leboro shel chaveiro. If your friend has a pit, a well, a swimming pool built close to his boundary with you, you can't build one in your property that is going to be close to his with only the fence between you. And it goes on. Unless you've left at least 3 tfachim between yourself, between this pit that you're digging and your fence, Vesad besid, and you've also lined it with plaster, you've plastered it in such a way that both the act of digging it, the vibrations of digging it, and the seepage of moisture, neither of those things are going to cause damage across the boundary to the well of the other person. The Gemara goes in and says, what's the din if the neighbor has not yet built his swimming pool? You're the first one. Can you now build your swimming pool right up to your boundary and say, I'm not damaging anything of the neighbors? Abai Amar Somech. Abai says, sure, there's no swimming pool there. Rav Amar Enu Somech. No, but there could be a swimming pool there in the future. You've got to leave in that option. And then we get into a machlokes Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi, and on Daf Yud Ches, Ravina says, the Rabbanan's principle is al hamazik l'archik et atzmo. The person who potentially causes the damage has to create the harchaka. He has to distance himself and protect his neighbor from that damage. Rabbi Yossi says, Ala Nizak Svirle. Rabbi Yossi holds no, the Nizak, it's the other guy who has to protect himself. So the question here is that principle that we had, does that also apply in the laws of neighbors, where I'm building a swimming pool on my property. I'm not in the area of nezek at all. I'm not intending or desiring to cause harm to anybody else. And in fact, my neighbor doesn't have anything there. I'm not causing any harm now when I'm building my swimming pool. Do I still have to create harchaka and make sure that I don't potentially cause damage in the future? Or is that not my problem? My neighbor has to take care. Once I've got the swimming pool, he must distance himself so that that he is not damaged. That's the Gemara as it unfolds. So what we're going to learn is built on the Nesivos. You remember the Nesivos is the Rav Milisa from the end of the 18th century, the time of the Ktsos HaChoshen, and he writes on Choshen Mishvat. He says, Lichora kasher, this is a classical Nesivos for this perek. Lichora kasher al kol harchakot shemoneh sham beferik lo yachpor Bava Batra. There's a difficulty with all these laws of creating distance to protect my neighbor from damage from what I'm doing in my property. There's a problem with all of that. What is the problem? He says all of these cases are really midalad avot nezikin heva. My amri rabbanon de'en tzarich l'archik. Why did the rabbanon hold in certain circumstances that the mazik doesn't have to create distance? This is like any other case of nezek. And it seems that even b'di'evid, if he didn't create distance, he's still patur. Even if I'm told I ought to create distance, but I didn't, there's no financial claim on me for that, according to the Rabbanon. And then he goes on to say, Da'adalad avot nezikin eino chayav aleihen rak keshe'efshar lachzik b'rishuto u'vishmira shelo yaziku. A foundational principle. In Bava Kama, all those laws that we learned only apply in a situation where the mazik is capable of keeping the object that causes the damage, let's say his ox, under control and under protection in his yard. So I'm allowed to have an ox, I've just got to make sure that my ox doesn't go outside and cause damage to other people. Then the Torah says you've got to look after it. So you remember in Bava Kama, we took this line right through Bava Kama, that the obligation is to protect society from your damaging animals. If you've got a bad dog, Keep him inside, keep him on a chain, make sure that you protect that he doesn't get out. And if you don't, you're chayiv. You've transgressed your obligation to protect society, and you're responsible, you have to pay. And then you have to pay if you didn't protect. But now that we get into this new perik in Bava Batra, who באופן שיתחייב לשלם העסק אין אפשרות לו לעשות תשמיש זה ברשותו כלל. What are we going to say? The only way you can be responsible for the damage caused by your swimming pool or your tree to your neighbor's property is by your not using that section of your property to put a swimming pool there or to plant trees there. ויתבטל תשמיש זה מרשותו, which means you are restricting the use of his own property. That's not like Bava Kama. Bava Kama is all about where your object is causing damage in somebody else's property or in the Reshut HaRabim. But to say you can't use your own property to plant trees or to build swimming pools, that wouldn't be right. This is your property. So there's no way you can build the swimming pool at the edge of your property and protect it from causing damage to the other person. And the Torah did not obligate a person to restrict his use of his own property. And that's how the Nesivos introduces us to these laws of lo yachpor, these laws of harchakot between neighbors, the distancing between neighbors. The Torah doesn't obligate me to limit the use of my property. That's where it starts from. Now, Reb Nachum Parchavich was the Rosh Yeshiva in Mir, and he died in the 1980s. When I was learning in Mir in the early 1970s, he was the Rosh Yeshiva. People came to Mir. He was Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, a son-in-law. People came to Mir to learn with Reb Nachum. He was just one of the. There were three exceptional young Rosh Yeshivas. At that time, they were in their 50s. He died very young. They all died very young. There was Reb Shmuel in Ponevezh, there was Reb Nachum in Mir, and then there was Rebbeinu Mishkovsky in Kfar Hasidim, where I was learning, and the three of them were considered to be the bright lights of that generation of Rosh Yeshivas, and they all died very young. But what was interesting about them, as I've mentioned before, that part of the privilege of my generation was to learn with people who were recognized already in Eastern Europe. These are people who learned, these were the bridges from Eastern Europe to modern Torah. These were the people who came to Eretz Yisrael, but they learned. Reb Nachum learned with Reb Baruch Ber. Reb Shmuel and Rebbeinu Mishkovsky learned with Reb Shimon Shkop and with others. These were people who learned from the great Acharonim of the time. They themselves were the end of the period of the Acharonim. And you'll see how Reb Nachum forges his own way in Lo Yachpor that only an Acharon can do. He starts off by paraphrasing the Nesivos. And on the second page of the source sheet, and he says, "Umuvuar bidvarav shehani lo yachpor ein behu din shmirat mazik klal." There's no law here about guarding your damaging object. That's not what lo yachpor is about. That you have a bad dog or ox and you've got to take care of him. No, it's not about that at all. Because there's no requirement to do so. So you're not a mazik. There is a chidush here. Even though you're not a mazik, you've got to create distance. And we'll have a look at that and try and understand why that is. Reb Nachum himself goes a different approach. I've brought the key parts of Reb Nachum so that those who want to go into it have the opportunity to do so, but we won't go into it deeply other than to notice that he brings the Ramban, who he believes holds differently from the Nesivos. And that the Ramban holds the Gam Hani de Lo Yachpor Shaychi le Parshat Mazikim Va'avot Nazikin. So you've got these two views, the Nesivos' view and the view of Reb Nachum. Based on the Ramban, the Nesivos says that Lo Yachpor, this section, is not talking about damages, that you're a mazik, that you're transgressing the laws of not causing damage to others. It's a law of the Torah, not just a societal law. Lo Yachpor is a law of Hilchot Shchenim. It's a different section altogether, that there's certain requirements. The way that Reb Nachum learns it is, yes, although we're talking about Hilchot Shchenim, and there are new laws and a new perspective here, once we have these rights of your neighbor to claim that you're too close to the border, that's really what it is. It's not that by building your swimming pool on the border, you're causing damage. You're giving the neighbor the opportunity to claim compensation or to tell you to move. And once he has the right to claim, now you become a mazik. So in both cases, what's important at the end of the Reb Nochem, ulefi zeh yesod pirkin hu chiyuv harchaka v'lo isur mazik. Whether you learn Reb Nochem's way or you learn the way of the Nesivos, and we'll keep them both in mind as we go through Lo Yachpor, whichever way you learn, the underlying principle is that Lo Yachpor, this perek of Gemara that we're learning, the yesod, the foundation, is the chiyuv harchaka, your obligation to create distance between your swimming pool or tree or whatever and your neighbor's boundary. That obligation, and it's not about isur mazik, the transgression of mazik, because mazik is a transgression. Reb Nochem's Rebbe, the Reb Baruch Ber, says in the Birkas Shmuel, "V'nire li, the din harchaka ikar mazik sheyesh lo tviya me'at al chaveiro." The laws here are based on the claims your neighbor has on you. The chol dine harchaka enam kedin mazik amor, because these laws of lo yachpor, of having to create distance, are not like mazik. The sham chala leidin mazik gam leinyan onesh bidei shamayim. Here you've got it articulated clearly, that in the case of Bava Kama, the damages are a prohibition of the Torah, and you're obligated ethically and morally, and you've transgressed, and there's a punishment from Hashem for that. Quite apart from the interpersonal claims that you have in a court of law, you've done something morally wrong by damaging another person. But here, here we're talking about claims that one person can have on another. You haven't transgressed an isur of the Torah by building your swimming pool at the boundary. You haven't transgressed an isur of the Torah by planting trees whose roots go into your neighbor's property. You haven't transgressed anything, but your neighbor has certain claims on you, and those claims are what Lo Yachpor deals with, the laws of Lo Yachpor. And we need to understand what is the nature of this chidush. If it's not called nezik, I'm in my own property. I'm not doing anything beyond my borders. I'm planting trees. And the Gemara goes in the Machlokes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanon Daf Yud Ches, the whole question of, am I actively causing damage? Is it a passive consequence of what I'm doing? But the fact is, I'm operating within my own area, and I'm not doing anything morally or ethically wrong. So what is Lo Yachpor all about it? So I'm not doing anything morally and ethically wrong if I don't understand the word shachein and what a shachein is. A shachein, we say, means a neighbor, but the word neighbor doesn't mean anything. But what does a shachein come from? It comes from that case with Bilam. Vayar et Yisrael shochein lishvatav. It's the way a society lives as a system. Even though it's broken into shvatim, into tribes, into families, into individuals, but those are only individual cells within a larger system. And if you're a cell in a system, as we've been discussing recently, you can't control the system, and you have no obligation to control the system, but you influence the system. Everything you do influences the system. And Lo Yachpor comes to teach us how to operate with a respect for individual privacy. I'm entitled to do what I want in my property, but on the other hand, there's this paradoxical tension. Yes, I'm operating within my own property, but I'm part of a bigger system of shchenim. And here we come to Hilchot Shchenim. How do people live next to one another as part of one system of neighborhood, and yet maintain their individuality, their privacy, and their own rights to operate within their boundaries as they want? And this applies not only to individuals, but also to national boundaries that separate nations from one another. But they're still part of a single overarching system of humanity. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, that's the struggle, is to understand individual identity, national identity, community identity, and yet to be able to see that we're part of one system. It's what's going on in Eretz Israel today. If we could only get that right. We need all these different parts. You need Dati Lumi, and you need Haredi, you need people who are learning all the time, and you need people who are learning and they're active in the economy and in the army, and you need people who are primarily active in the economy. We need all of these different people, but we're part of one system. And each person has an identity, each society, each community has an identity. But how do you manage that tension between your own identity as an individual, or as a member of a community or a society, and a national identity, or a universal identity? How do we manage that? That's part of what Lo Yachpor is talking about, to get us accustomed to attune our brains and to wire our brains into a way that constantly manages the tensions of the boundary between individuality and of system integration, of thinking of everything as a whole. And as we understand, again, whether it's Reb Nochem or it's the Nesivos, the foundational principle is that Yesod Pirkin hu chiyuv al chaka v'lo isur mazik. Here we're talking about creating distance as a member of the system, not a mazik who's transgressed his boundaries. I'm within my boundaries, but there's still a system. And how I show respect for the system is what this chapter of Gemara is about.